Claudius, scene by scene review, part 3. Let us now continue. This is episode 1. We are at about 7 minutes into the episode, where we are seeing a party at the house of Augustus, where the African dancers just left the scene and went off to be fed as a reward. And then we finally get our first scene of interaction between the characters of Claudius's family before he was even born. Apparently, the party that they're having is a celebration of an anniversary. 7 years since the Battle of Actium, and this is, of course, the famous naval battle where Octavian and Agrippa defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, after which the latter two fled and subsequently died in Alexandria, handing Egypt to Octavian on a platter. Now, I have to say a bit of a negative note on the series here. Why the hell did they have to cast actors who are that old to play Octavian and Agrippa, and especially Agrippa? This party they're having is supposed to be 7 years later after the Battle of Actium, which I think was in 31 BCE, and both Octavian and Agrippa were born in 63 BCE, which means that at the time of the battle they were both around 30, and since this scene is taking place just 7 years later, this means that they should be around 37. And would you look at Agrippa? The actor must be like 70 or something. And Brian Blessed doesn't look 37 either, though I guess he could pass closely. Anyway, I think maybe it's a general pattern for the series because now that I think about it, for some reason, all of the actors are somewhat too old to play the historical people at that time period. And let me say, it's not that big of a deal. The actors are all still great, but it just annoyed me a little bit this time round. And so we see the conflict between Marcus Agrippa and Marcellus, who is the young nephew of Augustus by his sister Octavia. And as we know, as brilliant as Augustus was, he had many, many issues. One of which was, if not the biggest one, his damn nepotism. Yes, he realized that the Republic was at this point crap, so he founded an empire, but then he couldn't see beyond his nose and realized that it should not be a hereditary empire, because you simply cannot rely on your offspring being completely adequate people. You can absolutely give birth to a complete piece of garbage, like a psychopath or something, or you could give birth to someone who just does not like politics. And so you end up fucked, because if your empire is inherited, then the power goes to a person that doesn't know what to do with it. And Augustus was too selfish to realize that, so of course, in the absence of his own offspring by Livia, he picks the next closest, which is his sister's son. And so Marcellus, since he's anointed to inherit the empire, he's already pampered as well, out of touch with the world, and cocky enough to dare to argue with Marcus Agrippa about the Battle of Actium being insignificant. It is the perfect recipe for producing an ancient Roman Joffrey from Game of Thrones. Of course, we can't know if the real Marcellus was a spoiled brat, but in all fiction, that's how he's presented. And it's the fault of, again, Augustus and his stupid nepotism that Marcellus ended up having this horrible reputation ever since antiquity. The poor kid died when he was just 19, which is horribly young. And we don't even know how he died, but still, the world knows him as the very first Julio Claudian Joffrey, who was also, by the way, according to fiction, poisoned like Joffrey. Just horrible. And it's all the fault of Augustus, his uncle. I used to admire the Emperor Augustus a lot before, and I still do now, but with a lot more reservations. When you take a detailed look at what he did during his years as emperor, the guy basically behaves like a mafia thug, which I guess it's only natural because this is Italy. You might very well say that the Julio Claudian dynasty is pretty much the ancient version of the Corleone family. Anyway, so the series presents us with the clash for the inheritance between Marcus Agrippa and Marcellus. And just as things are starting to get heated between them, the awkward situation is saved by the arrival of the cake That's in the form of a ship from the battle, Agrippa's ship, which is pretty awesome, I have to say. And this scene reminds me of Joffrey in Game of Thrones again, when it's getting heated between him and Tyrion, his uncle, at his wedding, and the conflict is interrupted by the arrival of, what was it, a pigeon pie. A really weird parallels now that I think about it. And as far as I remember, George R. R. Martin actually wrote the Purple Wedding episode, so it kind of looks like he stole the idea of the intrusive cake from Mike Claudius. Sneaky George Martin just stealing everything for his fiction from actual history without even bothering to cover it up. And so Marcellus becomes an even bigger asshole, calling Agrippa a candied cherry on the prow of the ship cake, meaning that he's basically famous for no reason at all. And understandably, Agrippa gets furious, because who wouldn't? And Augustus sinks to a new low of pathetic, just trying to distract everyone by any means possible from the argument, instead of just slapping Marcellus down like the pampered little boy that he is. And again, all because of nepotism. You know, this is why later on in my life I became more interested, more obsessed with the period of the good emperors. You have a so-called golden age with Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. And it's because they realized that nepotism won't do, which made them create sort of a fake nepotism system of adopting basically as a son the guy that they thought was competent enough without the guy actually being their real blood relative, or, I mean, at least their son directly. It's genius, like taking the overall nepotism idea but excluding the stupid part from it. And of course, this is a really simplistic explanation on my part, because the Golden Age idea is generally very limited and prone to falsehood. And also, Marcus Aurelius, although having been one of these good emperors, was actually stupid enough to go back to the real nepotism stuff, and so his psychotic son Commodus came to the throne and ruined everything for everyone. Anyway, back to the scene where Augustus is being stupid and pathetic because of nepotism. Kudos, by the way, to Brian Blessed. He really is a brilliant actor. The way he tries to force a smile on his face and thus being able to actually see that he's dying on the inside is just sheer genius. And so, to quiet down the fight, they bring in some Greek orator to give them a speech about the Battle of Actium, and we are presented to a bit of a Greek type, so to speak, in comparison to a Roman. The Roman might be a soldier, a ruler of the world, but the Greek is everything else that is ingenious. They're poets and orators, they're philosophers and inventors, and we are treated to a bit of that comparison in this scene. The Greek is about to give his speech, and one of the servants calls for silence in the room so he can start. And then a somewhat weird conversation ensues between the servant and the Greek, because the Greek gets impressed by his voice. They start talking about acting skills and theater, and the servant, who was apparently an actor, says the theater was not what it was. And the Greek replies, "No, and I'll tell you something else. It never was what it was." Which I have to say is just so stereotypically ancient Greek in terms of philosophy. Always making a fly out of an elephant, always having to say something that is supposedly deep, which you might as well just skip saying. And just as I'm starting to get annoyed by the Greek philosophical blah blah blah, Livia, as if having read my mind, interrupts them and more or less says, "Shut up and get to the performance." This kind of thing, is my overall problem with ancient Greek philosophy. I mean, I just love reading Plato and Aristotle and whatnot. And at the same time, they're so difficult to read because they bury you in a truckload of pages and pages of talk before actually getting to the point. And in most cases, it turns out it's a point that you can express in a couple of freaking sentences. But I guess in their mind that would defeat the purpose because their overall method was to convince the listener through detailed logical arguments, or at least Plato anyway, with his annoying Socratic method. Anyway, so after this, finally, we get to the speech by the Greek orator about the Battle of Actium. Let's cut the recording here and continue with it next time because I'll have quite a few things to say about the speech in question. I'll see you in part 4, and thanks for listening.